our panel for the evening. So if most of you heard from me, if you haven't met me, my name is Jennifer Richmond. I am with the Institute for Liberal Values. And I am so excited. I don't think I've been in a room filled with this many amazing people who aren't just thinkers, but who are also doers. Now, I have to tell you, do you ever, at least I do. I go to bed at night thinking about, like, if I was on the Joe Rogan show, what I would say. And I, like, run it through my head, I mean, and it's beautiful when I'm about ready to go to bed. I mean, it's so good. And Brandy just 5 minutes ago said, hey, I would really like you to start this off. And I was like, I didn't last night think about my Joe Rogan thoughts. So I'm not going to say too much, except for to say again, thank you so much for everyone who took the call to come here today. It's so important to me. As you know, my organization really focuses on liberal values and specifically with K-12 education. And I know most of you here do as well. For me, it really started with my son, and I know a lot of you here are parents. And it started when my son came home one day saying something completely ridiculous with no backing. So what some of you may know about me is I actually got into this world as a China scholar. I found myself one evening actually kept into a hotel room overnight when I was picked up by the Chinese secret police. Came back to the United States, and I heard about this DEI, and I love difference. I love difference. I grew up in Burma, I grew up in Indonesia, and I was like, oh, this is awesome, we're all getting into this now. And so I signed up for the City of Austin's DEI program, thinking, how cool is this? Having no idea what I was getting into. And I walked away from that, and it felt so very similar to how I felt being locked in a room with the Chinese government. And this is when I started to get involved in this. And this is when I heard my son start to parrot back these things uncritically. I made him sit down and write to me an analysis of why he has that opinion. This is the things about critical thinking that we'll be talking about. And then we got together the Coalition for Empowered Education, which is a bunch of groups that you probably know about, and you'll know more about them over the next couple of days. And we looked at ethnic studies, and we've expanded way beyond ethnic studies now. But really started saying these are people, Chinese, Cuban, Russian immigrants who came here from all over the world, and they started to see language in ethnic studies that mirrored what they saw back at home. And then they came here and they said, well, what now? And so we all started together as this coalition, a multi-ethnic coalition, to speak out against ethnic studies. And since then, it has gotten so much worse, and we see this politicization happening in all works, whether it's history or social studies, as we know, even math. So again, I am beyond thrilled to be in this room with so many amazing people. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. I look forward to speaking with all of you more. And I turn it over to my friend, Brandy Shufutinsky, and my colleague to moderate the panel, Building a New Education Movement, which is what we intend to do this next few days. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Is this on? Okay. So I know a lot of you in this room, but for those who don't know me, I'm Brandy Shufutinsky. I'm Director of Education with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. And you'll see a bunch of different folks here from JILV and a bunch of other organizations that are our coalition partners. I want to echo Jen's thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your schedules to be here with us. And hopefully we leave this, the next couple of days, not just more connected with folks that are actually in the fight to make sure that our K-12 education system is what it should be for our kids, but with knowledge on how it's impacting us because we're coming from all different places around the country. So I'm going to start this panel because for time's sake, one, I want to make sure that we have time afterwards for Q&A, but I want to ask each of the panelists to please briefly introduce yourselves, and then I really want to jump straight into the questions. If that's okay, so Elina, if you can start.
Thank you, Brandy. Thank you, Jen. And thank you for everybody for being here. So my name is Elina Kaplan. I'm with an organization called Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, ACES for short. I'm here with two of my co-founders, Barb Wyndham, Barb, raise your hand, and Jill Silverman. And our organization, who's a key partner with CEE, Coalition for Empowered Education, focuses on K-12 and removing ideological political agendas from K-12 ethnic studies and other social studies curricula. The perspective we take is that the issue is not necessarily ethnic studies itself or any particular topic itself, but rather how it is taught and the importance of promoting constructive, empowering curricula for all students.
Should I take this one?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. I'm Wei Hua Chen, and I'm the founding president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York. And we were founded really to do what the Chinese American Citizens Alliance for over 100 years has done, which is to fight for the rights, civil rights of Chinese, but by extension, it's not just Chinese Americans, it's all Americans. Because what's good for Chinese Americans is good for everybody, and vice versa. So the thing that we got involved in most was education, first and foremost, because there was such evil thoughts being charged, being made in the New York City specialized high schools. The mayor and the chancellor all said that there were too many Asians in the top schools. And whenever somebody starts slicing and dicing groups of people by their color, by their ethnicity, religion, whatever, and not by their individual talents and abilities and commitment and achievements, we have a problem. That's that kind of group identity. It's racist, it's destructive, it's divisive. So that's where we started off and got into a lot of the other things about curriculum, about how there are things that are manipulating and changing our children, our future, that will be destructive. And while I'm here, I will give a shout out to PLF, Pacific Legal Foundation. Joshua Thompson is over there. PLF is representing us pro bono on a couple of our cases against racism. So thank you very much, PLF. There's several of you here from PLF. Thank you.
My name is John Suarez. I'm here from the Center for a Free Cuba, and it's in part thanks to the politicization of higher education that I'm here before you today. My plan initially going to college was to become a biologist and do research in biology. And in the early 90s, at a faculty meeting in the biology department, a couple of academic commissars came in to explain to us that the scientific method and logical reasoning were patriarchal and racist. And that began my journey in the conservative movement. And I encountered the Leadership Institute, became a youth leadership coordinator, first in Nebraska in '92 and Iowa in '94. First a congressional race, later a governor's race, but in both occasions in Nebraska and Iowa, I ran into agents of the Cuban government trying to promote the dictatorship in Cuba as a model for America. And in '94, it was even more shocking because they were taking large numbers of Midwesterners to Havana to brainwash them with that ideology. And that sort of led me to decide, rather than continue Republican politics, to try to communicate the reality of what life is like in Cuba to an English-speaking audience. And that's how I ended up today in the Center for a Free Cuba as executive director. I think also that when we look in the Cuban model, when the communists took over Cuba, one of the first things they did was completely politicize education. And Fidel Castro early on said the university was for revolutionaries. And if you weren't a supporter of the revolution, you were not allowed to study in the university. But also from kindergarten through 12th grade, they completely politicized the workbooks. So imagine if your child is learning how to read the alphabet, and it would be C is for Che Guevara, F is for fusil, rifle, and there would be an image of a rifle. Also, the other thing they did was completely cut off parents from any control over the curriculum and sending the children to work in the fields in the countryside for months at a time, separated from their families, to have full control over their indoctrination. So when I hear these things taking place here, it's very reminiscent of what we saw in the Cuban example in history, which has been a disaster for the Cuban people. The other thing I wanted to touch on is the idea of political correctness and also repressive tolerance. What we see in academia, my experience when I was before I got involved with the Cuba stuff, I was just in conservative youth activism. And I also got involved with the Young Americans Foundation, so we brought some conservative speakers to speak on campus. We had Jack Kemp, we had Phyllis Schlafly, we had Pat Buchanan. I was told back then that I was harming the university by having these voices on campus, that I was a threat. They don't want to have diversity of views, including when they talk about ethnic studies. My experience of ethnic studies was it's Marxist studies, but they use different colors and patinas to justify what they're pushing. If there's an authentic look at different cultures and civilizations and their individual values, those things tend to be washed away because it's not convenient in advancing the Marxist agenda. And I think we need to talk about Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, repressive tolerance, which basically is, and you see this most clearly if we look at 2020, the folks who were burning down the cities across the country, they weren't locked up, but the ones that rioted on the Capitol are locked up. So the idea there is, if you're engaging in certain criminal behavior, it's acceptable. In other cases, it's unacceptable, depending on what your agenda is, versus the rule of law, where everyone is treated the same under the law, which is what you need for a free society to function. So I just wanted to say thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to hear what everybody else has to say. Thank you very much.
Hello. Namaste everyone. I'm Sangeetha Shankar and I'm here on behalf of the Hindu American Foundation. We are North America's oldest and largest education and advocacy organization that advances the rights and representation of Hindu Americans. We were started 20 years back by 4 second-generation Hindu Americans who really felt the need for a professional organization that represents our communities. I work as a California Regional Director and I'm based out of Sacramento here. I heard that maybe I'm the only one who's in Sacramento amongst us, so I'm very happy that for once I don't have to travel. So really glad to be here. Thank you for having me. In my role as a California Regional Director, I touch upon 3 main areas of work. One is advocacy, where I act as a liaison between our communities and policymakers, constantly looking out for bills or policies that might hurt our communities. The second major thing that I do is education, where I lead the outreach to all of the local school districts and law enforcement agencies, where we make sure that Hinduism and our communities, Hindu American communities, are represented accurately in classrooms, as well as law enforcement agencies understand what it is to be interacting with our communities. And the third area of focus is community engagement and community building. I travel across California, offer high quality programming, and I empower our folks to be able to represent themselves, speak up for themselves, because we face, many common issues like basically being, ridiculed for, say, drawing out our very holy symbol, which is a swastika, which often is misconstrued as the Nazi hate symbol, which is the Hacken cross. So lots of things like that. A majority of our Hindu American communities are immigrants, first generation immigrants, and so they're learning to speak up for themselves in a manner that the law enforcement here understands, the communities here understand. So that's a major part of my work. Once again, really glad to be here. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So I want to, Elina, throw the first question to you, at least first, and then if anyone else wants to chime in, of course, please do. So as K-12 education is becoming more politicized, we often hear that education is and should be political. What are your thoughts about the appropriateness of politics in the classroom?
So as we're talking here, I'm struck by the fact that we've got 3 people in a row, Cuba, China, former Soviet Union. I immigrated as a teen, that all come from communist countries. This is not a coincidence. The fact that people that grew up with these systems feel viscerally what we're experiencing right now in education. And the idea of politics in education is ground zero. The idea that education for ages has been used, K through 12 in particular, has been used as ground zero for indoctrinating kids, indoctrinating of people. So that fact that there's a lot of sensitivity from people and a responsiveness from people that have grown up in these systems, in these communist systems, I think is very telling. Is there a place for politics in education? Sure, if you are teaching a political science class in K through 12, then of course there's a place for politics in education. And there is a place, the way that you would teach it is by sharing different political points of view. That is really one of the very few places where there's a place for politics in education. Short of that, I think there's a difference between indoctrination education versus actual education. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about throughout the summit is how to use the lens of education rather than indoctrination and centering the student rather than the ideology. A lot of the work that we do at ACES is showing the distinctions between what does it look like to indoctrinate kids and to paradigma. I think John was using that word paradigma back, versus what does it look like to use critical thinking. And I think the number one challenge, the number one problem with politics in education is that it very quickly veers into dogma in education and results in kids parroting back that dogma rather than using their own judgment and using critical thinking skills.
Anyone else?
I'd just like to add that you know that the education system here in America has veered off on the wrong course when you have most of the teachers all espousing these thoughts that you're talking about now. It used to be that it was fairly even and you kept politics out of the classroom. You are not supposed to know whether you're a teacher were a Democrat or a Republican. But it's very clear now that it's gotten to nearly one party. And whenever you have one party rule, you have a very, very easy way of tyranny. You also know that when there are songs about Obama that were being taught to elementary school kids, that's really bizarre. You could like Obama, but that shouldn't come into the classroom. And certainly when you start getting the song, if we want to talk about Nazism and communism and Marxism, that certainly smacks a little bit of that. And so we have to be very careful about that, because we, in this group, have seen the abuses of government, of an authoritarian government. And it starts with the mind, the thinking, at a very young age.
Thank you.
I just want to point out that you have the ideological commissars, you have the true believers, but you also have nation-state actors. And the FBI in 2014 put out a report, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages, titled Cuban Intelligence Targeting of Academia. At Florida International University, they set up sending students to Cuba. And it turned out that the professor that was running the program was working for Cuban intelligence. He was arrested by the FBI, sentenced to a number of years in prison. So was his wife for not revealing that her husband was acting as a spy for the Cuban government. I also had the experience in 2002. Harry Wu, a Chinese dissident, was going to speak at Florida International University with an activity organized with Cuban dissidents on the anniversary of International Human Rights Day. And all of a sudden, the bureaucracy of the university became very hostile to the event. They tried to cancel it. We found out later it was because the university was negotiating with Beijing to open up a campus in mainland China. Thanks to us moving around quickly, we were able to circumvent the bureaucratic controls. But I had a situation where I literally had the police on campus call me in and ask me why I and the president of the university were trying to circumvent the natural process of things to have this gentleman speak. And he was able to speak. There was some media, and it obviously did portray Beijing in a negative light. But you can see that it's not just a situation of left-wing activists. There are also nation-state actors involved in academia. I think now, and this I don't have first-hand knowledge, but what I've read about is, for example, these anti-Israel protests around the country. It seems that Qatar and other Middle Eastern powers have been pumping money into the university to push an anti-Semitic agenda. So I think we have to have that in mind when we're talking about how to counter this.
Yeah. So I agree with my co-panelists that politics is a part of everything, literally, in the sense that all subjects are intertwined, right? Whether it's science or arts or technology, really depends on whether the governments or your countries enable you to do this specific amount of research. Like if you go back to history, we know that people have been killed in jail for declaring that the earth revolves around the sun. So this has always happened. And presenting it purely in a historical perspective is what is needed. And that then makes our children and students think critically, okay, this happened in the past, this is what is happening now, and what should I do later on in the future? But right now what we see is nothing is really off limits in the classroom. And social political narratives especially really are dividing our children into looking at community and society as good and bad. There is no other groups that they can see out there. And especially with the Hindu American communities, I can speak from a personal experience that we are constantly divided into good and bad Hindu American immigrants, mainly from being constantly projected into the framework of the caste system. And we are also then projected as, adjacent to white supremacists, racists. If you've done well, that means then you're privileged. And these are words that our own children are coming and mouthing and throwing back at us in our families. So most of us come as, immigrants, most of us come as students, probably with $100 and 2 suitcases, because that's what the airlines will allow. And we kind of like build our lives from there. But yes, there is a focus on education, there is a focus on community building, and making it big, that destiny is in your hands. If you put in the hard work, things will follow. But that philosophy is now coming back to us and being, we are being charged for it in the sense that you are privileged, that you come from these families that have always focused on education, that are focused on community building. So no matter what you do, you're always wrong. So our kids end up then feeling guilty, always feeling like they've done something wrong, that they're privileged, and that they don't deserve this. So these kind of slow, just chiseling away at our young minds is what we're seeing in terms of politics being in the classroom.
So one of the things that I'm sure most everybody that is working in the K-12 space has seen is this idea of systems of oppression, which I think plays off of that idea of privilege that you mentioned, Sangeetha, that if somebody has real or perceived success, they must have achieved that through ill-gotten gain, so through the exploitation of others, and created or benefited from a system of oppression. And so we're seeing that in education, there's this idea that's being pushed that systems of oppression need to be dismantled. So how do you think that belief impacts the education system, the K-12 education system? Let's just stay there. Whoever wants to start. You want to go first? Okay.
I think that there are 2 main problems with teaching kids that systems need to be dismantled. The first one is obvious to everybody, I think, that the idea that we probably don't want to be going around teaching kids that they need to break things for them to work, right? So just fundamentally and instinctively, I don't think we need to be discussing why is it a bad thing to teach kids to teach students, to teach anybody young that the thing to do is to break something and start again. So that's one. But the second, I think, is more nuanced, and that is that it's very difficult for kids to feel a sense of control if what you're telling them is that the only way that things will get better is if they break and you start over again. Because any individual child, any individual student can't accomplish that. So what you'll see, and we've seen this in various lessons and various curricula, one of my favorite images, favorite in quotes, was where you see, was out of San Francisco, where you see a big giant, and Quincy's smiling because she's familiar with this one, where you see a big giant circle. It's supposed to be like a Venn diagram. It's a big giant circle that says things you cannot control, and a little tiny dot that says things you can control. Think about that for a moment. What is that teaching kids? That everything is outside your behaviors, nothing that you do really matters, but everything else is what matters, and the only way that things will change is if we dismantle what we have and start over again. So I think that those are at least two of the key, the very fundamental problems of teaching kids that the main thing to do, that the entire world is made up of systems of oppression, and the only way to tackle it is to dismantle them and start over again.
I would like to add that if you're talking about oppression and victims, because that's how you start off, you divide the world into oppressors and victims. That pits us against one another as groups, not as individuals. You know, you can't go and compete as an individual, you have to compete as a group. But what does that mean when you wake up? It's loss of agency, that's a real problem. But it's also a sickness. If you think about it and imagine that you as an adult are told, you're going to be an oppressor, you're going to be a victim, and you keep on thinking that. What does this mean in true trauma? They like to talk about trauma, right? So you're reinforcing this trauma, which is created in most cases, because these are narratives that are created, they're fictions. Yes, there is true oppression, and yes, there are true victims, but when you make it so broad, we're going to find people who are appropriating others' victimhood. That's what happens, because you have to define yourself that way. And if you thought about it, you would normally say, you know, if you think of yourself that way as a victim all the time, or you think of yourself as an oppressor all the time, what does it mean? It means you need therapy, guys. So we're trying to teach a lot of our children to become sick. And so that's one of the things that we have to stop, getting them sick and getting them back to focusing on what education really is about.
I'd just like to add that one of the works that deeply impacted me in terms of what you have control over and what you don't is an old book called Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, where he had an idea of what are the external factors you have no control over, but what do you have control over in terms of your own personhood, and how you need to maximize that control, that discipline to be able to carry out and do what you need to do to have a good life within the possibilities you have. That isn't what these folks are pushing. What they're pushing for is not a recognition of the spark of divinity that each of us has as a human being, but having us categorized by groups. Why? Because the ideology that these folks initially had, which thought that history had an inexorable path to a future of a communist utopia, failed. It failed because the working class became wealthy in a capitalist society, and that capitalist civilization continued to grow and evolve, and people were living the good life. So what you end up having is these folks come together and say, all right, Karl Marx pure doesn't work, let's try some Freud. Let's look at the differences in terms of race, ethnicity, sex, sexual orientation, and try to pit everyone against each other with what objective? To destroy the society. And that's what I think is what we're seeing with this systems of oppression. You're trying to create divisions and target, and if you look at what Mr. Marcuse has to say about this in the Frankfurt School is, you need to find the people that are marginalized in the society, the criminal element, and empower them to overthrow the existing system. Because although people feel good, they're really in a trap and it needs to be destroyed. So even though you're living in a society where, you know, let's say in the case of Western Europe, you have a month-long vacation and people are traveling, no, you're really oppressed, and that needs to be all torn down and then replaced with what? Right now in Cuba, this past week, people have not had electricity. Why? Because the communist elite, which is unaccountable to anyone, has been robbing the country blind for decades. They haven't invested in the infrastructure, and the infrastructure has collapsed. Children are dying because their insulin is going bad because of the lack of electricity, and the food is rotting. And yet you have people here in the academia that try to pretend that's a model to follow.
Yeah, again, I agree with all of my co-panelists. It really helps to be the last person because they say most of the things. I'm like, okay, I don't have to say that. I don't have to say that. But to me, I think when we talk about systems of oppression, it really means, you know, to the young minds, everything needs to be destroyed. If anything is right, it comes with injustice. We have to feel guilty about it, and we have to change it. So imagine when you're a young person in school, the amount of burden that you carry when you feel that everything around you is wrong. Whereas when I grew up in India, I'm an immigrant, I came to this country 20 years back. I was a very happy person around that age, right? I was enthusiastic about growing up, about studying, about exploring the world. I would be curious about different races, different religions. I had a sense of optimism, but I don't see that in the young minds anymore. And a lot of it also has to do with them feeling so scared about, so hesitant about saying anything. Oh my God, since when have we become so apologetic? You know, you just have to say potato, for example, and there'll be like many people will be offended by it. Literally, that's how this country is right now. And because of that, like I have an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old, and often they correct me, no, you cannot say that, no, you cannot say this, and I'm like, says who? You know, since when have you become so scared about saying things out? And specifically with the Hindu American or Indian American communities, what happens in schools is that systems of oppression are basically taught without sharing, you know, the complex history that a country like India has, right? If you have never been to India and the only thing that you read about Hinduism when you opened your 6th grade textbook was that there are 4 castes, there are these castes that discriminate against these castes, there are the oppressors and the oppressed. And trust me, even today in schools, in classrooms, social studies teachers, as part of their practical project, divide the classrooms into 4 castes and say, if you are a Brahmin, then you should be this. If you are a Kshatriya, then you should be this. And so many times it has happened that when I step out and I say I'm a Hindu American, people have asked me, are you a Brahmin or a Dalit? You know, so you are projecting ideas without giving all of the complex narratives and the histories behind a certain country or certain race. And you end up then putting into the young mind that if they see a Hindu American or Indian American, then they have to be either an oppressor or an oppressed. You take away a sense of agency, you bring in victimhood, you're constantly inflicting guilt. And with our children especially, many times they learn about the caste system or being oppressed or oppressors for the very first time in the classrooms. So it makes them feel extremely awkward. They feel isolated, they feel bullied. The Hindu American Foundation did a survey and asked our students about how they feel when they were taught about the caste system in schools. And you know, a majority of them felt bullied. I get calls from parents all the time from communities where you know, the children come home crying, or the 6th grade textbooks when all of this language around oppressors and oppressed, specifically with respect to the Hindu American communities, is introduced, children are actually scared to go to school, and parents don't know how to deal with it. So, basically when you talk about systems of oppression, I think there has to be a lot of context, there has to be enough time to discuss everything. It has to be done with a lot of background. I think like when I go to the school districts and talk to teachers, many times they have no idea. They've been given some resources, they have very less time. Social studies and history, specifically in this country, is taught pathetically. I was raised in India, I did a K-12 in India, and I knew all about the US in terms of how, the birth of this country, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King. I even knew the song, Alabama. Pardon me?
Stairway to Heaven.
No, what I'm trying to say is that I learned a lot more about American history than I think people here learn about Indian history or other parts of the country, other parts of the world. So we need to, radically think very differently about how we teach our subjects in the first place.
Thank you. I mean, you probably learned a lot more about American history than American kids are learning about American history.
Also depends what American history they're learning. One of the things that shocked me back in 2020 was Senator Tim Kaine out of Virginia. June 16, 2020, he said the following: "The United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody, we created it," quote unquote. Obviously, Senator Kaine is wrong. The earliest known written reference to slavery is found in the Code of Hammurabi, 1754 BC in Babylonia, in what is today Iraq, in which it stated, "If anyone take a male or female slave of the court or a male or female slave of a free man outside the city gates, he shall be put to death," unquote. The Arab slave trade began in 643 with the Islamic conquest of Tripoli and Libya, and it continues to the present day. Chattel slavery was initiated by Portugal in 1444 when Portuguese slave traders transported sub-Saharan Africans to Europe. Portugal also initiated the transatlantic slave trade in 1526, shipping slaves to their colony, Brazil. I know Americans like to feel self-important, but you guys didn't invent slavery, you didn't start the transatlantic slave trade. The history is bad enough on its own, you don't need to exaggerate it. The history of slavery in America is horrible. The history of Jim Crow is horrible. But you need to put it in the context of the world. And the world's been a rough and horrible place as well. I think we also need to look at the same people that talk about systems of oppression also are hostile to free speech. And when we look at the history of America, in the midst of slavery, you had people like Frederick Douglass that, using the First Amendment, were able to challenge the system of slavery in America in the most strident terms. And where did he end up? He ended up becoming, towards the end of his life, a U.S. diplomat representing the United States abroad. I mean, we need to take that into consideration as well. Take the good and the bad. And that's something that's often lost.
I think that's a great place to ask the last question before we open it up for any questions from everybody else. And I'm going to start at the other end, Sangeetha, because you're right. Sorry.
And I complain a lot, don't I?
No, everyone please, give your elevator pitch to how you would propose we build a new education movement.
Yeah.
Fix it quick in 30 seconds.
So I think really as a California regional director, every time I hear from my communities, I just wish that our parents were included more when curriculum reforms happen. Advocacy organizations like ours are a part of the conversation as well. And also, I think a big part of reforming the current education system is to look out for what's happening in the school boards. What we're seeing is that it's highly politicized, and it's very important that all of us have a constant update on what's happening in the school boards and what kind of ideologies are being pushed. Another thing, like I said, is that I wish that history was taught a lot more in this country, not just like these snippets of information that's given in the 6th grade and in the 9th grade and the 10th grade, but start off early, make it a mandatory subject. and learn more about world history so that people sitting in the United States are not learning about other cultures and communities in a very narrow lens. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think one, we need to look. You talk about it. It's a new movement, but we need to go back to first principles. And I think classical education has a lot to offer. I also think there was a scholar a generation ago by the name of Mortimer Adler, had something called the Padea Proposal, which looked at the classical approach, but also had certain principles. One, all children can learn, therefore they all deserve the same quality of schooling, not just the same quantity. The quality of schooling to which they're entitled is what the wisest parents would wish for their own children, the best education, for the best being the best education for all. I think that also involves being very cautious about the personnel selected. Personnel is policy. Merit, not race-based. The pursuit of excellence, not equity. And one of the things I was blessed, I'm 55 years old, so I was going through primary school and high school before a lot of this craziness. So I was able to experience going through, pursuing excellence, reading the great books, going back and through European history, world history, and getting introduced to Confucius, the Bhagavad Gita, as well as Shakespeare, you get the Cervantes. A lot of that, from what I hear, is being lost these days. And also the idea of the gifted. Those who can receive more should be allowed to and be able to get into calculus and advanced mathematics, physics, chemistry.
Yes.
And that's not only good for the children, but also necessary for our civilization to continue. So I will leave it at that.
I will, not being the last one, still say I agree with the ones who said before me. I think that with all of those, I think we need to have transparency. We need information, very clear, because parents don't know what's going on in the classrooms. So we should make it so that teachers have to be able, they must just give the information that they're teaching in the classroom. For them to say that, oh, we don't want to tell the parents what's happening, that's ridiculous, okay? And that goes into many things. It goes into what's happening now in many areas of the country where the teachers are told they are not to tell the parents if their children's genders are being changed. And in many cases, they are actually being groomed. They are groomed to think. Most 5-year-olds cannot think of whether they are going to be a fireman or a basketball player the next week, let alone several years from now, but they're being told that they're not really a girl, they're not really a boy. And it's actually happening because this is in this legislation from several places where you cannot tell. It's happening in New York, it's happening in California. And so that is part of this trying not to tell parents things. So it needs to be, we do have to have people to be informed. And then the other thing is freedom. Because once you're informed, you have to have the ability to move to the right places where you can get the proper education. And so the more school choice there is, the better. Now, what are we going to build as far as schools go? We want the classic education, that's one thing. The classic liberal values in education that we all believe in. I think that we all nearly know it, and we don't even understand why people are questioning it. Because that is that ability to challenge the thoughts. So we need our kids to be getting a healthy, informed learning, okay? They have to be healthy so that they're not sick, as I've said before. You can't have this kind of oppressor or victim, because if you wake up every day thinking that you're either a victim or you're an oppressor, you're going to be one sick person psychologically. You have to be informed. You have to learn the right facts. Don't just listen to narratives. You have to be thoughtful. You have to get all of the facts, get the right facts, and then be taught to think. about things. And that is the kind of learning that we need.
Okay, Sangeetha, I sympathize now. It is hard to go last. Okay, so yes to parents having transparency, to having parents more engaged, having community members more engaged. I think one of the things that I would say is, and I know we're going to spend a lot of time over the summit talking about what are things that we can all do as group leaders and as different organizations. I think one of the #1 things we can do is build to a critical mass of people to start pushing back. There is no question in my mind that the vast majority of this country, if they understood completely what was happening, would not want it. And I think maybe even a couple of years ago, I would have said that most of them have no idea. I think now people are starting to get the sense that something is off. Something is not right. They don't quite know what it is. And I think one of our most important jobs is to get the word out there and to get people to start speaking out, because we will not be able to change this until we can build up to a critical mass. One of the things that we can do is empower the parents and community members as they learn more to communicate with the decision makers. It's interesting, with our work at ACES, what we find is it is shocking how often the administrators themselves don't know what is being taught in the classroom. Whether it be the administrators or the board members, don't know until you put it in front of them and say, really, do you think this is okay? Now, I'm not saying this is everybody, and there are certainly administrators and board members that have activist agendas, but I would approximate that most of them don't, and most of them just don't know. So getting parents, getting community members to speak out and just start pushing back on this, I think has to be part of I don't know if you want to call it the new movement or the new old movement, to get back to the basics of education. One example of where we can see that is the difference between activism and civic engagement. And so that's a perfect example where we see the difference between students writing to their elected representatives about, let's say the teacher says, a cause that is important to you. Now contrast that with a teacher that says, write to your elected representatives about why standardized testing is racist. The latter is what we're having more and more of in school, and I'm not passing judgment on standardized testing, yes or no, that's not the point. The point is that we can get there, that activism that people are talking about, the politicization that Brandy was talking about earlier about politics in education, it doesn't mean that you don't teach students to be active, engaged members of society. But there's a difference between active, engaged civic members versus activism per se. And I think that too has to be part of this new movement.
Thank you all very much. I think that there's a microphone in the back if anyone here has questions. Is it turned on?
Maybe I can add a couple of comments for this new educational movement. My job tomorrow will have my panel. First, I think we need to address comparative study. Why? Before I waited in line, try to get to America, like many other immigrants, we admire America, such a great country. But when we come to America today, this kind of liberal, radical textbook teaches us America is so bad, right? Actually, from like 19th centuries, first Britain, abolished the slavery, and then America leading civil rights movement. We actually treat the immigrants, treat all people of color the best among, all over the world. We need to put ethnic study in this kind of comparative, context. That's number one. Number two, I really suggest, we need to really separate the time frame. Historically, absolutely, America made some mistake, right? That was slavery. But ever since the civil rights movement, all the laws no longer, if anything, discriminate against like black, all being abolished. Like affirmative action actually discriminate against white and Asians, right? So we really clearly draw a line, say, okay, after civil rights movement, in the 21st century, all laws, if there's no any systemic racism, all the laws, all the policy are favor of black and other historically disadvantaged community. So I think for this movement, I suggest we really add the comparative study. Another is draw a line. What was history? What is today? So that's my comments.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
I'm just going to take 1 second before we run out of time, and we'll keep going with questions, but I just wanted to call people's attention to one thing. In your folders is a letter that looks like this. It's on top it says Coalition for Empowered Education. This is a letter about ethnic studies and about the idea of empowered constructive ethnic studies and the importance of having that versus the politicized extremist version. I request if your organization, this is specifically for groups and organizations, if your organization has not already signed on, if you could do one of two things, either read it, obviously, and then either sign it and give it to Jen, myself, or Brandy, or on the inside of the folder of the booklet, there's also a letter the same letter, and it shows you Jen's contact info is there as well as the website. So if you could do that, you could do it in that online form as well. Okay, back to you.
Well, thank you. I have been working in California. I've discovered that the board policies, it's a standard board policy system in California. And there are a number of board policies that refer to these various aspects of things you're talking about. For instance, 0415 is equity. And typically the critical race theory stuff is in that board policy. If you look in 6141, throughout California, that is a policy that requires balanced teaching. And that is something we've tried to get where I live, and they just rewrote it so they didn't have to give balanced teaching, because these are things you can use against them. The queer theory stuff is in 5145.3. I'm just saying a lot of this stuff goes back, it's been written. There's a lot of good stuff in the board policies that you can use against your school district. And I just want to point that out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good follow-up. We are trying to get our district to adopt 6144, but the teachers union is pushing back because they thought it would restrict how they teach. But I looked at all the ed code and the Supreme Court cases. Every item in the board policy 6144, instruction on controversial topics, every item is supported by existing law and Supreme Court cases, which means even if you don't adopt, if teachers don't follow those, they are actually violating existing law. But what I would like to talk about is, I feel like, I guess my name tag here says community activist. I'm not really with an organization, but I've been helping parents. I was on the school board and now I'm on the city council, but I'm still helping parents when they are facing issues on how they can communicate with the school board. But I feel like this effort cannot sustain because in my kids are after college now. So in that group of parents, after the kids went to college, they don't care anymore. And in 2020, I helped another group of parents because 8th grade teacher was teaching Ibram Kendi books in the social science and history class. like 1/3 of the class was studying that book. So that woke up a lot of parents. They start to file a lot of public records requests. We have a no CRT at CUSD website, and then they were doing a lot of things, and then 2 years later, their kids moved on. This group of parents are not doing anything. Now I'm helping another new group of parents who are finding out transgender topics is being taught in TK classroom. So we are fighting against the teachers union trying to adopt this instruction. And this is a whole new group of parents that I have to educate. Feels like this older group, they don't really care now. There are only a few handful left, but most of them moved on. And then now I'm trying to help this new group. In 2 years, likely most of them would move on, and I'm the only one that's still there. So I don't know.
I'll just comment on this. I know you're not making a question there, Leon, but you've been marvelous in doing all of this, and we know how hard it is because we don't have super big bucks on our side. We don't have a Soros on our side, okay? We don't have a lot of the groups that will get the kind of money. A lot of us are really grassroots volunteers. And that's why we really are extremely grateful for the ones that started off as grassroots, like ILV, okay, like ILV, like PDE, Parents Defending Education, and they build this kind of infrastructure. We have to start building the infrastructure, as Elina was saying, and then later have it grow to incorporate more people and groups so that we can keep on generating new people, because it's absolutely true. When the parents age out, so to say, because the kids got out of the elementary school and they were not too damaged, you go on to the next crop. But I think that we have to think as taking some of these groups that have done so much, so well, and then bolstering them to have some sort of continuity.
Thank you. I actually I'm trying to be mindful of the time and everybody traveling and getting in late today, including myself. So I want to pause here. Our panelists can stay for a couple of minutes. If anyone else has any other questions, you can come to the table. But first, I want to thank Jen, thank everyone on the panel, and I think we'll break here until tomorrow morning.